Hello, White Level. Today is Wednesday, the 3rd of March, and this is our midweek Bible study for this week. I want to go through it. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 30, and so turn to 1 Samuel chapter 30. If I were to ask you what is your favorite passage of Scripture, many people could point to that, and I have many. And so I tend to divide them up by what's my favorite topic on this or what's my favorite passage on this. And if I were to look at my favorite passage about David, about King David, this is one of two or three that are right there at the top. There's so much on King David in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, um, and other places, Psalms and other places in Scripture. But this story here, and one that comes up in 2 Samuel in his reign dealing with Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, this passage we're going to look at today, and that one is probably one of my favorites. And the reason is that as we go through it, and we're probably going to spend a couple of weeks on 1 Samuel chapter 30, but as we go through it, what you're going to see is a wonderful picture of who David was as a person. It's a great story. It's well told. It's gives you all these fascinating details, and those fascinating details really stick out as having importance for understanding how to live a God-centered life and how it informs the decisions you make and also the pitfalls of serving God and following Him. There's a lot that you can learn on leadership from 1 Samuel chapter 30. There's a lot, so for me as a pastoral leader, I can learn a lot from David, one of the greatest leaders of all time. And 1 Samuel chapter 30 is one of the great lessons in leadership in the story of David. And so it's just really fascinating. It's an emotional story. It is one that I think could make a wonderful movie if anyone in telling the life story of David. There have been a few movies over the years, and they tend to focus on David and Goliath and Saul running after David and David defeating armies and then becoming king, and then the situation with Bathsheba, then him being, and it skips over some of these little stories. I think the little story that is found in 1 Samuel chapter 30 it is sort of a great example of who David is. And if you just told one story that sort of let you know who David was and what he was about and what kind of man he was, you can't do much wrong with 1 Samuel chapter 30. So I'm excited today. I'm already rambling, which means I'm excited. So let's get into the text. 1 Samuel chapter 30. Now, when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, so let's just stop here and figure out where we're at. Ziklag is the town that the Philistine king of Gath had given to David, and when he was sojourning with them, and so David sort of had authority and rule over this little area. In fact, he was given and retained by David and then passed on to be part of the king's property of Israel. Of Israel and then just Judah. David, was going out to war with the Philistines, David and his men, and the rest of the Philistines didn't trust David, so they wanted him to go back, and he's going back now. And it says, they came to Ziklag on the third day, so really a 3-day journey to get back. And while they were gone, something terrible happens. Now, David and his men had been living with the Philistines since they left Israel for about a year and a half. And what they did was different. This was sort of we're leaving, we may never come back. Now, I think David, even though part of that idea of we're leaving and may never come back, I think David always understood that God was going to fulfill his promise to him, but David didn't know when or where. Saul wasn't a very old man, so it still could be many, many more years of him ruling. And so David didn't know how long he would have to stay exiled from Israel and living with the Philistines. So what they did is they brought their families with them. They sent word and brought. David has 2 wives at this point, which really has 3, but Saul has given his wife Michal to someone else, and so really he has 2 wives. David brings them, and he's got children by now, and all of his men as well. They bring their wives and their children to live at Ziklag. Well, when they go off to war, that doesn't leave many people behind to sort of protect. That just leaves the women and the children. And so what happens is the Amalekites, one of the oldest foes, one of the ones that God had already said many times that he intended to execute judgment on. He wanted Saul to do it. Saul didn't do it. David has done it in a piecemeal fashion. And while David is gone, they are going to come back. Now, David has been raiding them, remember? They were allied with the Philistines. David's raiding into the Amalekites and other people's territory where they're going to exact some vengeance on David while he's gone. And so we see in the rest of verse 1, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. So the Amalekites fight and attack Ziklag and the region of the Negeb, which is where David was. This is actually supposed to be still part of the promised land. Where David is at in Ziklag is part of the inheritance that was given to Caleb in the book of Joshua for his faithfulness when he was sent in to spy with Joshua and the 10 others that were not faithful. God had promised to give Caleb and his descendants a inheritance. This is that area that David is now in. These Amalekites fight and come and they burn the village to the ground. They burn this city to the ground, and they take all the women and the children and all the livestock and everything with them, probably intending to sell them as slaves, probably intending to keep some for themselves, but also sell others into slavery. And in Jewish culture, there was only one thing worse than death. There is one thing worse than death, and that is being sold into slavery. Even to this day, what Jewish people read as part of their Passover celebration, says, may we meet again next year, something like, may we meet again next year free and not slaves. There is this constant reminder with the Passover every year that we spent 400 years as slaves in Egypt, and never again will we be slaves. And now David and his men, their wives and children, have been taken probably to be sold into slavery. It doesn't really lay that out explicitly in the text, but that was generally what would happen. Is they would kill the men and take the women and the children to be sold into slavery. And so they burn the city down. David and his men ride up back to Ziklag, and they see this destruction. And I compare this moment in David's life to like a 9/11 style moment. And what I mean by that is I remember, that's one of those things. Do you remember where you were? And people know where they were. We remember, we have like it ingrained in our memories, the events of that day and how they unfolded for ourselves and our nation. And it was a major turning point event. David had been in many battles, but this one he will remember. This situation he will remember because he comes back and his own land. David had always taken the fight to other people. Well, now the fight has come to his home and it's been destroyed. And his wife and his wives and his children are taken and potentially to be sold into slavery and abused and hurt, and his men are in the same situation, and this is an emotionally cathartic experience because of the destruction they see and how it's affected them. And so let's read verse 3. And when David and his men came to the city, this is their reaction. They found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons taken captive, sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. The people that are with him are his soldiers. These are soldiers of the Iron Age. These are men who were used to fighting battles with their bare hands and clubs and spears and maybe, arrows, but this is not people fighting a war from a distance. These are hardened men of war, and they're weeping. And their weeping is so strong. So the emotional impact of this moment, feel that in the text, that there is great emotional impact. David, a man anointed by God, a man protected by God, a man who was called one after God's own heart, a man who had seen so much grace and had such a strong relationship with God, is going to suffer a catastrophic experience. One of the things that I think the story of David teaches us is that no one in this life is above feeling the destructive nature of sin impacting our lives. And what I mean by that is cancer, illness, sickness, death are all the results of sin entering this world. They may not be the result of your specific sin, but they're a result of living in a sinful, fallen world, and none of us escape the effects of the fall. All of us have situations in our lives that reflect hardship, destruction, suffering because of the fall. All of us will endure some form of suffering. None of us get out of this life without a degree or measure of suffering. And while you may think someone else is suffering less, you may not have lived it the way they did. And I was reminded that a couple of weeks ago. I listen to a lot of podcasts about religious things, but also political things, and read a lot of columns. And one columnist had been stuck, that I read pretty regularly, had been stuck with his family in Texas during the cold snap. They had gone down there. Him and I think his daughter had gone down there to sort of have a trip, to a neat city, Austin, Texas. And they were expecting, let's do it in the winter when it's warm. And they they were stranded. They're living in a hotel. And he's talking about how he's writing in an article about how difficult it was, and offering any price just to get a granola bar for his daughter. And some people attacked him because oh, you're doing this woe is me thing, when there were people that actually died in the cold, or had their property damaged, or lost everything they had because their pipes burst. And and you're just complaining because you got a little hungry. And his point was interesting that he made is just because another's pain or suffering is greater, that doesn't diminish the fact that my pain is real. So just because someone else is suffering greater, if you can measure such things, and I don't know that you necessarily can, but it doesn't mean that your own suffering is any less. And so, we shouldn't try to compare ourselves on some sort of suffering scale. And but the point is that while others might seem to have an easier way through the world, it doesn't mean they're going to escape suffering, because I've never seen anyone, the richest, most spoiled and pampered among us, never seen met anyone that didn't have a degree of suffering in their life. David was no exception. David and his men are devastated. But there's a great lesson to be learned in what they do and what they don't do, and what David does and what he doesn't do. So let's look at that. David's 2 wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So they talked about stoning David because their wives and children had been taken captive. Notice how horrible, this was. It David's fault? Well, not really. It was his obligation to lead the men and lead them into war. They were following David, and they had no illusions that they were men of war. David had no prior knowledge. Well, maybe David should have left some people behind to protect the village, but I didn't, you don't necessarily, he probably didn't, think it was necessary. Or maybe he did. Text doesn't tell us. Maybe he did leave a small garrison behind of soldiers and they were just overwhelmed. But either way, David wasn't responsible for the sinful attack. The Amalekites were. But the people were wanting to blame David. Here we come to a truth, and I found this to be true in my life, and you probably have in yours as well. Anytime you're in any position of leadership, whether the situation is caused by you or not, if a negative situation comes, then you're going to be held responsible for it, whether you did it or not.